It was one of those rare mornings where everything seemed perfect. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and Jack, the sheriff of a small county in the United States, had finally managed to brew a cup of coffee without forgetting to add sugar. Life was good, or at least it was until his phone started buzzing like an angry hornet. Jack glanced at the screen and saw his sister Emily's name flashing. He answered, expecting her usual cheerful banter about her garden or her latest baking disaster. Instead, he was greeted by the sound of sobbing. "Jack, they destroyed it. My house, it's gone," Emily wailed, her voice cracking into 1,000 pieces. Jack blinked, confused. "What do you mean, destroyed? Did you accidentally burn another pie and take the whole kitchen down with it?" He joked, trying to lighten the mood. "No, it's not funny. The HOA demolished my house," Emily shrieked. Jack froze mid-sip of his coffee, nearly choking on it. "Wait, what? The HOA? You mean those people who send passive-aggressive letters about your lawn being half an inch too long?" "Yes, them. They said my house violated some rule about aesthetics or something," Emily cried. Jack set his coffee down, now fully awake. "All right, calm down. I'm coming over." As Jack drove to Emily's neighborhood, a picturesque suburban enclave governed by an HOA with more rules than a medieval kingdom, he couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of the situation. How could a homeowners association demolish someone's house? Did they think they were running their own little dictatorship? When he arrived, Jack's jaw dropped. Where Emily's charming two-story home had once stood was now a pile of rubble that looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Or perhaps Karen, the infamous HOA president who ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist wrapped in pastel cardigans. Standing amidst the chaos was none other than Karen herself, clipboard in hand and a smug expression plastered across her face. She looked like she had just won a medal for most arbitrary abuse of power. "Ah, Sheriff Jack," Karen said sweetly as he approached. "What brings you to our lovely community today?" Jack stared at her, incredulous. "Karen, why is my sister's house a pile of debris?" Karen sighed dramatically as if she were explaining basic arithmetic to a toddler. "Well, Sheriff, Emily's house was simply not up to code. It violated our aesthetic guidelines. You know, harmony and uniformity are very important for property values." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Aesthetic guidelines? Her house was perfectly fine last week." Karen waved her clipboard dismissively. "Oh, but it wasn't fine. The roof was too tall compared to the neighbor's garage. And don't even get me started on the color. It clashed with the hydrangeas on Mr. Thompson's lawn." Jack pinched the bridge of his nose in frustration. "Karen, did you even give her notice? Or file anything legally?" Karen puffed up like a peacock. "We don't need to file anything legally. We're the HOA. We act in the best interest of the community." Jack stared at her as though she'd just declared herself Queen of England. "Karen, you do realize that demolishing someone's property without legal authority is a crime? You can't just play God because you don't like hydrangeas." Karen scoffed and muttered under her breath about how people didn't appreciate her efforts to maintain neighborhood perfection. Meanwhile, Emily approached Jack with tear-streaked cheeks and a folder full of permits and legal documents. "Jack," she said shakily, "I have all my paperwork here. The building permits from the county, HOA approval from last year when I renovated, everything." Jack flipped through the folder and nodded grimly. Everything checked out. Emily had followed every rule and regulation to the letter. "Karen," Jack said firmly, holding up the folder like it was Exhibit A in court. "Emily's house was built legally and approved by your own HOA last year. You had no right to demolish it." Karen rolled her eyes as though Jack were being overly dramatic. "Well, Sheriff," she said with mock politeness, "sometimes rules need to evolve for the greater good." "The greater good?" Jack repeated incredulously. "Karen, this isn't some dystopian novel where you get to rewrite reality on a whim." Karen smirked and gestured toward the rubble as if it were a modern art installation. "Sheriff Jack," she said condescendingly, "I understand this might be hard for you to grasp since you're not familiar with community governance." Jack cut her off with a laugh that could only be described as maniacal disbelief. "Community governance? Karen, I enforce actual laws, Not whatever nonsense you scribble on that clipboard. Karen bristled but tried to maintain her composure. Well, she sniffed indignantly. If you have any complaints, you can bring them up at our next HOA meeting. Oh, trust me, Jack said with a grin that promised trouble ahead. I'll be there. As Karen strutted away like she'd just won an imaginary argument, Jack turned to Emily and gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Don't worry, he said softly but firmly. We're going to fix this. Emily nodded hesitantly but still looked devastated as she stared at what remained of her home. Jack glanced back at Karen and muttered under his breath. She has no idea who she just messed with. Jack stood in the middle of the wreckage, his boots crunching against the debris that had once been Emily's living room. He couldn't decide what was more absurd, the fact that Karen had unilaterally decided to play Demolition Queen or that she seemed genuinely proud of herself for it. As he surveyed the scene, Emily clung to his arm like a shipwrecked survivor clutching a piece of driftwood. Jack, she sniffled, her voice wobbling. What am I supposed to do now? My home is gone. My life is in shambles. And Karen's over there acting like she just won a Nobel Prize in neighborhood tyranny. Jack gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Don't worry, Em. We're going to get to the bottom of this. Karen might think she's untouchable, but she's about to learn that there are two things you don't mess with: family and the law. As if on cue, Karen sauntered over, clipboard in hand and a self-satisfied smirk plastered across her face. She looked like a cross between a PDA president and a Bond villain. Sheriff Jack, she began in her signature condescending tone. I hope you're not planning to interfere with HOA business. We have everything under control here. Jack raised an eyebrow. Under control? Karen, you demolished someone's house without warning or legal authority. That's not under control. That's chaos. Karen tilted her head and gave him a pitying look, as though he were a particularly slow student in her imaginary HOA academy. Oh, Sheriff, she said with a sigh. You clearly don't understand how these things work. The HOA has full authority to enforce community standards. Emily's house was an eyesore, an affront to our carefully curated aesthetic harmony. Aesthetic harmony? Jack repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. Karen, this isn't Versailles. It's suburban America. Nobody cares if the roofline doesn't match Mr. Thompson's hydrangeas. Karen gasped as though he'd just insulted her personally. Nobody cares? Sheriff Jack, I'll have you know that property values are directly tied to aesthetics. If we let one person slide, it sets a dangerous precedent. Jack crossed his arms and stared her down. Dangerous precedent? Karen, you tore down someone's home because it didn't fit your personal vision of suburban utopia. That's not enforcing rules. That's a power trip. Karen bristled but refused to back down. The HOA bylaws give us broad discretion to maintain community standards, she declared, waving her clipboard like it was the Constitution. Broad discretion doesn't mean unlimited power, Jack shot back. And unless you can show me where in those bylaws it says you can demolish someone's house without due process, I suggest you start preparing for some very uncomfortable conversations with my office. Emily perked up at this but still looked skeptical. Jack, she whispered, do you really think we can fight this? Karen has everyone in this neighborhood wrapped around her finger. Jack smirked and leaned in close enough for only Emily to hear. Oh, we're not just going to fight this, he said with a glint in his eye. We're going to make sure Karen regrets ever picking up that clipboard. With that, Jack turned back to Karen and plastered on his best professional smile, the kind he reserved for particularly stubborn suspects who thought they were smarter than him. Karen, he said smoothly, I'm going to need copies of all HOA documents related to this decision. Meeting minutes, votes, notices, everything. Karen blinked, momentarily caught off guard by his directness. Well, I don't see why that would be necessary, she stammered. It's necessary because I'm investigating whether any laws were broken, Jack replied evenly. And trust me, Karen, you don't want me finding out that you skipped any steps. Karen hesitated for a moment before regaining her composure. Fine, she huffed. I'll have our secretary send over the documents tomorrow. Make it today, Jack said firmly. Karen opened her mouth to argue but thought better of it when she saw the steely determination in his eyes. She spun on her heel and marched off toward her car, muttering something about how ungrateful people didn't appreciate all she did for the community. As soon as she was out of earshot, Emily turned to Jack with wide eyes. "Do you think she actually has any documents?" she asked. Jack snorted. "Not a chance," he said. "But we're going to find out exactly what kind of mess she's gotten herself into, and then we're going to use it against her." Over the next few hours, Jack dove headfirst into the world of HOA governance, a labyrinthine nightmare of bylaws, covenants, and restrictions that seemed specifically designed to confuse and frustrate anyone who dared challenge them. He pored over Emily's paperwork and cross-referenced it with public records from the county office. By the time he was done, Jack had uncovered several glaring inconsistencies in Karen's story, not least of which was the fact that there had been no official vote or meeting regarding Emily's house at all. Armed with this information, Jack decided it was time for round 2 with Karen. He found her holding court at the neighborhood park pavilion, a makeshift throne room where she dispensed arbitrary rulings on everything from mailbox designs to acceptable shades of mulch. "Karen," Jack called out as he approached, holding up a stack of papers like they were evidence in court. She looked up from her clipboard with an annoyed expression. "Sheriff Jack," she said coolly, "what can I do for you now?" "You can start by explaining why there's no record of any HOA meeting or vote authorizing the demolition of my sister's house," Jack said bluntly. Karen flushed but quickly recovered. "Oh, well, sometimes we have informal discussions among board members," she said vaguely. "Informal discussions don't count as official decisions," Jack countered. "And even if they did, you'd still need to notify Emily before taking action, which you didn't." Karen opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss for words, a rare occurrence indeed. "That's what I thought," Jack said with a triumphant smirk. Before Karen could recover enough to launch into another tirade about aesthetics or property values, Jack delivered his final blow. "I've already contacted an attorney who specializes in HOA litigation, and let me tell you something, Karen, you're not going to like what happens next." Jack didn't waste any time after his confrontation with Karen. He knew the best way to deal with someone like her wasn't just to fight fire with fire, it was to bring a flamethrower to the party. Karen had made one critical mistake. She underestimated Jack, assuming that his role as sheriff was limited to breaking up bar fights and writing parking tickets. What she didn't realize was that Jack had spent years navigating bureaucratic nonsense, dealing with stubborn officials, and outsmarting people who thought they were untouchable. Karen was about to learn a very painful lesson. The first step in Jack's plan was simple: gather allies. He started by reaching out to other residents in the neighborhood who had been victims of Karen's reign of terror. It didn't take long to find them. There was Mr. Thompson, whose hydrangeas had been deemed too vibrant for the community's aesthetic standards. Mrs. Patel, who had been fined for hanging wind chimes on her porch, and the Johnson family, who had received a cease and desist letter for building a treehouse that Karen claimed violated airspace regulations. Jack organized a meeting at Emily's temporary rental home, her new headquarters, as Jack jokingly called it. The group gathered around Emily's dining table, which was covered in coffee mugs, legal documents, and a plate of cookies that Mrs. Patel had brought as moral support. "All right, folks," Jack began, leaning forward like a general addressing his troops before battle. "We all know why we're here. Karen has been running this HOA like her personal fiefdom, and it's time we put an end to it." Mr. Thompson nodded vigorously. "She fined me $200 because my hydrangeas were too cheerful." "What does that even mean?" "She told me my wind chimes were auditory pollution," Mrs. Patel added indignantly. "And she said our treehouse was a threat to aviation safety." Mr. Johnson chimed in, shaking his head. Jack raised his hand to silence the group before things devolved into a full-blown venting session. "Listen," he said firmly. "Karen's power comes from two things: her position as HOA president and her ability to intimidate people into submission. If we want to stop her, we need to hit her where it hurts, legally and publicly." Emily looked skeptical but hopeful as she glanced around the room. "Do you really think we can take her down?" she asked. Jack grinned. Oh, we're not just going to take her down. We're going to make sure she never picks up that clipboard again. The group spent the next few hours strategizing, poring over HOA bylaws and compiling evidence of Karen's abuses of power. Jack had already uncovered several key pieces of information during his initial investigation. Karen had falsified meeting minutes, ignored proper voting procedures, and unilaterally enacted policies without board approval. All blatant violations of HOA rules. But Jack wasn't content with just exposing Karen's misconduct. He wanted to humiliate her in front of the entire neighborhood. To do that, he needed a public showdown. A spectacle so undeniable that even Karen couldn't worm her way out of it. The opportunity came sooner than expected when Karen announced an emergency HOA meeting at the community center to address recent concerns about neighborhood governance. Jack suspected she was trying to do damage control after their earlier confrontation, but he saw it as the perfect stage for his plan. On the day of the meeting, Jack arrived early with Emily and their newfound allies in tow. The community center was packed with residents, some loyal supporters of Karen, others curious onlookers hoping for drama. Karen stood at the front of the room like a queen addressing her subjects, her pastel cardigan practically glowing under the fluorescent lights. "Welcome, everyone," Karen began in her usual syrupy tone. "I've called this meeting to discuss some unfounded accusations that have been circulating about our HOA leadership." Jack smirked from his seat near the back of the room. "Unfounded accusations? That's funny. I seem to recall you demolishing my sister's house without legal authority." Karen froze for a split second before regaining her composure. "Sheriff Jack," she said sweetly, "I understand your concerns, but I assure you everything was done within HOA guidelines." Jack stood up and held up a thick folder of documents like it was Excalibur itself. "Really? Because I have evidence that says otherwise." The room erupted into murmurs as Jack walked to the front of the room and placed the folder on the podium next to Karen's clipboard. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jack began, addressing the crowd like a lawyer delivering his opening statement in court. "What we have here is a clear case of abuse of power by your HOA president." Karen tried to interrupt him, but Jack raised his hand like a traffic cop signaling her to stop. "Let me finish," he said firmly. He opened the folder and began reading aloud. Forged meeting minutes where Karen claimed unanimous votes that never happened. Emails where she threatened board members into compliance. Fines issued without proper documentation. And most damning of all, records showing she had personally hired the demolition crew without consulting anyone else. By the time Jack finished speaking, the room was dead silent except for Karen's increasingly frantic attempts to explain herself. "Well, you see, it was all for the greater good," she stammered. Jack raised an eyebrow and turned back to the crowd. "The greater good? Is that what you call destroying someone's home because you didn't like its roofline?" Several residents nodded in agreement while others muttered angrily under their breath. Karen looked around desperately for support but found none. Her loyal followers were suddenly nowhere to be found. Jack leaned closer and lowered his voice just enough for only Karen to hear. "You might want to start thinking about how you're going to explain all this when my office files charges against you." Karen paled visibly but tried one last desperate tactic. Playing victim. "This is all just a misunderstanding," she cried dramatically. "I've always acted in the best interest of this community." Jack didn't even bother responding. He simply turned back to Emily and smiled triumphantly. As residents began demanding Karen's resignation and calling for an audit of HOA finances, a suggestion that made Karen look like she might faint, Jack knew they had one. Not just legally, but morally as well. The fallout from Jack's public takedown of Karen was nothing short of spectacular. The community center had transformed into a chaotic circus, with residents shouting over each other, demanding explanations, apologies, and in some cases, Karen's immediate exile to a remote island where she could terrorize palm trees instead of people. Karen, who had spent years cultivating her image as the benevolent dictator of the HOA, now looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an 18-wheeler. Her pastel cardigan suddenly seemed less like a symbol of authority and more like a tragic costume choice. Jack stood back and watched the chaos unfold with the satisfaction of someone who had just toppled a house of cards. Emily, standing beside him, whispered, I can't believe this is actually happening. She's losing it. Oh, she's not just losing it, Jack replied with a grin. She's watching her entire empire crumble in real time. Karen, desperate to regain control, raised her hands in an attempt to quiet the crowd. Please, everyone, she pleaded, her voice trembling but still clinging to its trademark condescension. Let's not jump to conclusions. I've always acted in the best interest of this community. Best interest? Shouted Mr. Thompson from the back of the room. You fined me $200 for hydrangeas. Hydrangeas? And what about my wind chimes? Mrs. Patel added indignantly. You called them auditory pollution, but you didn't say anything about Mr. Johnson's leaf blower. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red as more residents joined the chorus of complaints. It was as if years of pent-up frustration had finally reached boiling point, and Karen was the unlucky recipient of the explosion. Jack decided it was time to deliver the final blow. He stepped forward and addressed the crowd with the authority of someone who knew exactly how to command attention. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife through butter. I think we've all seen enough to know that Karen's leadership has been less about serving this community and more about serving herself. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, drowning out Karen's feeble attempts to protest. And let me remind you, Jack continued, holding up a copy of the HOA bylaws like it was the Holy Grail. This association exists to benefit all residents, not just one person's ego. Karen finally snapped. Ego? She shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that could shatter glass. I have dedicated years to this community. I have sacrificed my time, my energy. Your sanity? Jack interjected with a smirk. The crowd burst into laughter, and Karen looked as though she might spontaneously combust. Realizing she was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Karen tried one last desperate tactic, appealing to sympathy. She clasped her hands together and said in a trembling voice, Please, I only ever wanted what was best for all of you. Jack raised an eyebrow and crossed his arms. Karen, he said dryly, if you wanted what was best for everyone, you wouldn't have demolished my sister's house without warning or legal authority. Karen opened her mouth to respond but quickly closed it again when she realized there was no defense for what she had done. At that moment, one of the HOA board members, a mild-mannered man named Greg who had spent most of his tenure quietly nodding along to Karen's decisions, stood up and cleared his throat. I think it's time we take a vote, he said nervously. A vote? Karen repeated weakly. Yes, Greg replied firmly. A vote on whether or not you should remain president. The room fell silent for a moment as everyone processed what Greg had just said. Then, almost as if rehearsed, the residents began chanting, Vote! 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 Karen looked around frantically for support but found none. Not even from her most loyal followers, who were now either avoiding eye contact or pretending they didn't know her. Greg motioned for everyone to settle down and then turned to Jack. Sheriff, he said hesitantly, would you mind overseeing this vote? You seem impartial. Jack grinned. Impartial? Not exactly, but I'll make sure it's fair. With that, Greg handed Jack a clipboard and a stack of voting slips while Karen stood frozen in place like a statue made entirely of bad decisions. The voting process was swift and decisive. Residents lined up one by one to cast their votes while Karen hovered near the podium like a ghost haunting its own funeral. When the last vote was cast, Jack tallied up the results and turned to face the crowd with a triumphant smile. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. The results are in. Karen has been officially removed as HOA president. The room erupted into cheers so loud they could probably be heard from space. Karen looked as though she might faint or possibly burst into tears, but instead she simply grabbed her clipboard and stormed out of the community center without another word. As soon as she was gone, Greg stepped forward again and addressed the crowd nervously. Well, I guess we need to elect a new president. Several people immediately shouted suggestions, some serious, Mrs. Patel, and some less so, Sheriff Jack. Jack held up his hands to quiet them down. Thanks for the nomination, he said with a chuckle. but I think I'll stick to enforcing laws instead of writing HOA rules. Emily leaned over and whispered in his ear. You'd make an amazing president. Jack smirked but shook his head. One dictator per neighborhood is enough. I'll pass. As the residents continued debating their next steps, Jack turned to Emily and gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Well, he said lightly, I think it's safe to say Karen won't be bothering you anymore. Emily smiled for what felt like the first time in days. Thanks for everything, Jack. I don't know what I would have done without you. Jack shrugged modestly but couldn't resist adding one last jab. Hey, it turns out all those years dealing with stubborn criminals prepared me perfectly for dealing with stubborn HOA presidents. Jack thought the drama was over after Karen's unceremonious dethroning. But as it turned out, Karen wasn't the type to go quietly into the night, or anywhere quietly for that matter. The very next morning, she showed up at Emily's rental house with a face like thunder and a stack of papers clutched in her hands. Jack was sitting on the porch, enjoying his coffee and the sweet taste of victory, when he spotted her stomping up the driveway like an angry goose. Oh, look who it is, Jack said cheerfully as Karen approached. The former queen of HOA land. What brings you here? Did you come to apologize? Karen ignored his sarcasm and thrust the papers toward him. I demand justice, she screeched. Jack took the papers and skimmed them, raising an eyebrow as he read. Karen, he said slowly, this is a handwritten list of grievances against every single person in this neighborhood. You've got complaints about hydrangeas, wind chimes, tree houses, and, wait, someone's choice of barbecue sauce. Yes, Karen snapped. Mr. Johnson uses that cheap store-brand barbecue sauce that smells awful. It's ruining the ambience of our community. Jack stared at her for a long moment before bursting into laughter. Karen, he said between chuckles, you've officially lost it. I have not lost it, Karen shrieked. I am fighting for justice. This neighborhood is falling apart without me. Jack set the papers down and leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee with exaggerated calmness. Karen, he said casually, you were voted out because you demolished someone's house without permission. I don't think anyone cares about your opinions on barbecue sauce right now. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of purple as she pointed an accusatory finger at Emily, who had just stepped outside to see what all the commotion was about. This is your fault, Karen shouted. You turned everyone against me. Emily blinked in disbelief. My fault? Karen, you destroyed my house. It was an eyesore, Karen shot back. Jack stood up and placed himself between Emily and Karen before things could escalate further. All right, he said firmly. That's enough. Karen, I suggest you leave before you make things worse for yourself. Karen huffed and stomped away, muttering under her breath about how ungrateful everyone was. Emily turned to Jack with wide eyes. Is she serious? She asked. Oh, she's serious, Jack replied with a grin. But don't worry, she's officially powerless now. As it turned out, Jack was only partially correct. While Karen no longer had any official authority as HOA president, she decided to take matters into her own hands by launching a one-woman campaign to regain control of the neighborhood, or at least make everyone's lives miserable in the process. Over the next few days, residents began reporting bizarre incidents. Anonymous notes left on doorsteps demanding compliance with obscure HOA rules, unsolicited inspections of lawn ornaments, and even mysterious fines for offenses like excessive cheerfulness and unauthorized bird feeding. Jack knew it had to be Karen behind these antics. Who else would care enough to wage war against bird feeders? So he decided to pay her a visit at her home, which was conveniently located right across the street from Emily's rental house. When Jack knocked on Karen's door, she opened it wearing what could only be described as battle armor. A visor hat, gardening gloves, and a clipboard strapped to her chest like a shield. Sheriff Jack, she said coolly. What can I do for you? Jack gestured toward her clipboard. I think we both know why I'm here. Karen feigned innocence. I have no idea what you're talking about. Really? Jack said dryly. Because I've got half the neighborhood complaining about mysterious fines and notes that sound suspiciously like your handiwork. Karen sniffed indignantly. I'm simply trying to restore order to this community. Order, Jack repeated with a laugh. Karen, you're not restoring order. You're terrorizing people. Karen crossed her arms and glared at him. Well, if people would just follow the rules. There are no rules anymore. Jack interrupted. You're not president. You don't get to make rules. Karen opened her mouth to argue but quickly closed it again when she realized there was no defense for what she'd been doing. Jack sighed and softened his tone slightly. Not because he felt sorry for Karen, but because he wanted this nonsense to end once and for all. Listen, he said firmly but calmly. You've lost your position as HOA president because you crossed the line, big time. If you keep harassing people like this, I'll have no choice but to file charges against you for harassment. Karen paled visibly but tried one last desperate tactic. Playing victim again. I was only trying to help, she cried dramatically. Jack raised an eyebrow and gave her a long look that said everything without saying anything at all. Finally, Karen sighed in defeat and muttered something about how ungrateful people didn't appreciate all she'd done for them. As Jack walked away from her house feeling victorious yet again, Emily called out from across the street, "How'd it go?" Jack grinned as he crossed the road back to Emily's rental house. Let's just say I don't think we'll be hearing much from Karen anymore. Emily laughed and gave him a playful nudge on the arm. You're amazing. You know that? Don't let it go to my head, Jack replied with a wink. And just like that, life in the neighborhood began returning to normal, or as normal as suburban life could be after surviving Hurricane Karen. Emily started rebuilding her house with help from neighbors who were more than happy to pitch in after years of enduring Karen's tyranny together. As for Karen, she retreated into obscurity, not because she wanted to but because nobody cared enough to listen anymore. And so ended one of the most ridiculous and satisfying revenge stories in HOA history. If you enjoyed this tale of suburban drama and sweet justice served cold, don't forget to like this video. Share it with your friends who've ever dealt with their own version of Karen. Comment below if you've got your own HOA horror story, and subscribe for more hilarious tales of revenge. Thanks for watching.